This video is sponsored by Skillshare.
Hello everyone, and welcome to my brand new miniature painting studio space. I'm still setting things up here, so I'm not really ready to do a full tour of the space yet, but one of the things I've been really happy with is my airbrush setup. So I thought this might be a great opportunity to do an Airbrush Basics video where I show you my setup, all the tools and supplies that I use when airbrushing, as well as some basic techniques of how I use my airbrush setup on a daily basis. So down to the absolute basics, here's my setup. I have a ventilation booth in the corner with a hose attached that vents all of the paint air out of the window, and I really recommend you get one of these if you're going to do any sort of serious airbrushing work. There are a ton of booths like this for sale online, and there are also a lot of tutorials online on how to make your own airbrush booth, but I like this one in particular because it has two fans, which really helps with the suction, and it's a lot wider than the typical ones, so it gives me a lot of working space. As you can see, it does have some built-in lighting, but personally, I like to use desk lamps with daylight bulbs when I'm doing any sort of airbrushing beyond just doing priming, and that usually lights up the space pretty well. The next part is, of course, the compressor, and it's a pretty simple compressor. I don't really think you need a specific compressor to do airbrushing. This is like one of the cheaper ones from Amazon. The only thing you really want to make sure is that it has a tank up top and like one of these regulator things down here so you can change the PSI. So a few things to note here. When it's on, you really don't want to touch the top of the compressor as it gets quite hot. And ideally, you also don't want to plug this thing into a power bar. I'm not entirely sure why. It might just be the amount of power that it draws. But I've heard that it is better if you plug your compressor directly into the wall rather than using extension cords or power bars. The main controls here are just the on and off switch. And when you're done airbrushing for the day and you do want to turn it off, the steps you're going to take are you're going to turn off the switch, and then you're going to press on this little thing here, which is called a moisture trap, to let any excess moisture out of the compressor. Once all the moisture is out, you can then pull on the pressure release valve to release any excess air in the tank. And once you've done that, you can your setup is done for the day. And if you're curious about the specific model of compressor or spray booth or anything I use in this video, I will be providing affiliate links down in the description to everything, so go and check that out if you're curious. Finally, we get to the airbrush. So I have this is my Iwata HPCS Eclipse, and I actually just bought a brand new one of these because my old one was getting pretty old and I pretty much destroyed it after using it for 5 years. I thought I would treat myself to a brand new airbrush. Over here you can see I have all the essential things that I need. Got some primers, some paints, as well as a little thing of water for cleaning out my airbrush. Now, as for how I use this thing, I'll just take you through a quick demo of how I would typically do an airbrush session. So I would start by turning on the compressor. I figured there's gonna be a ton of questions for this video anyway, so what I was thinking is I'll show you my basic workflow of how I airbrush, and then you can leave any comments or questions you have about how I airbrush down in the description, and then I can make a second video where I talk about the details of any questions anyone has about airbrushing stuff. So to start out, I'm just gonna turn on the compressor. Sorry about the noise. And you can see it's filling up with air. The PSI that I generally use is probably somewhere around 50. It doesn't always show that it's 50 on here, but you can adjust the PSI with this little knob here. So once the air compressor is on, it funnels the air into here, into the airbrush. And this is what you call a dual action airbrush. It's the only kind I've ever used, but basically you push down for air and you pull back to create a wider cone. This would probably make a lot more sense if I had paint in the airbrush. So let's take a look at what that looks like. But before we get into that, I'd like to tell you a little bit about this video's sponsor, Skillshare.
Skillshare is an online learning platform that offers a variety of courses on any subject you can imagine. In the past, I've taken courses here on photography, web design, and productivity.
And I think it's a really good option if you're looking to broaden your horizons as a creative person.
Most courses consist of a video learning portion as well as a hands-on portion to apply the skills you just learned.
I was actually really happy when they reached out to me. As you can see, I'm in a new space now, and I could really use some tips on videography and sound so that I don't have this awful echo all the time.
Personally, I've just started taking Marquez Brownlee's course on scripting, shooting, and editing YouTube videos to learn some new tips for making videos in my new studio. And I'm really looking forward to taking more courses, maybe some of the ones on acrylic painting on Skillshare in the future.
So if you'd like to join me in doing some creative learning in your spare time, check out the link down below in the description.
The first 1,000 people to use the link will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare.
So don't delay, check it out today. When airbrushing, before we do any airbrushing, I think it's a good idea to wear a nitrile glove or a latex glove on one hand. Whatever your non-airbrushing hand is, the hand you're going to be holding the model with. So today, what are we going to paint today? This is my little test minion for airbrushing, so maybe we'll use her to show you some techniques. So the most basic thing that I think it's useful to have an airbrush for is for priming. At least that's what I like to use it for. It creates a better priming experience, and you can do it any time of year instead of having to use spray cans outside. So when I'm doing priming, generally I like to put a little bit of airbrush, or when I'm putting anything in there, honestly, even if it's paint or primer, you're gonna wanna put a little bit of airbrush thinner into your airbrush first. I just squirt a little bit in there. And some people say you should mix your paints outside of the airbrush, and they're probably right, but I never do that. So I just like to mix the paints inside the cup of the airbrush. I try not to put, when I put paint into the airbrush, I try to put it on the side so it's not going directly onto where the needle is. And then I will mix it around with a cheap garbage brush. Oh, you should also be wearing a respirator when you do this. I don't know if it's really necessary to wear a respirator with when you're using acrylic paints, but if you're using any other kind of paints, you should really use a respirator when you're doing any of this painting. So the way this works is, you can see here on our minion, I'm gonna press down, and you can see that's what creates air coming out. And then as I pull back, oops, you can hear the compressor is filling up again with air, which is what happens whenever you use up all the air. So anyway, we're gonna push down, creating some air, and then pull back slowly. And as we pull back, it's gonna let more air out of the brush. So you can see it creates a small line. The more you pull back on the airbrush, the wider of a stream you're gonna get. And that's pretty much how you use an airbrush. You push down to get air, and you pull back to widen your stream. Now, once we're done with this paint and we want to change colors, we're going to want to clean out our airbrush. And to do that, we're first going to dump the excess paint into a container. I use dedicated Tupperware for this task so that I can just put a lid on it later and not be subjected to the awful smell of airbrush thinner. And we're just going to dump out any of the excess paint into this container. But as you can see, there's still quite a lot in there. So the first thing I like to do is use a squirt bottle full of water to just rinse out the cup a few times. Once it's looking pretty clean, I then use a paper towel to mop up any excess moisture in the cup. And then to really get it cleaned out and just to help the airbrush be nicely lubricated in general, I like to put a little bit of airbrush thinner in the cup at this point and then spray this out onto a paper towel until it runs completely clear. We can then use this paper towel, which is now covered in paint thinner, to give the cup of the airbrush one final scrub to get out any of the dried up paint, and then we're ready for our next color. Now that my airbrush is clean, you can see I am adding a little bit of thinner and then our second color, which is actually a white primer. After mixing this up with our brush, we can then spray one of our already black primed miniatures directly from above to get a nice map of where our lighting should be. This technique is called Xenothal Priming, and it's something I do to 80% of my miniatures before painting them, just because it's so useful to have a white undercoat for the bright colors and a black undercoat for the shadows and recesses before painting almost anything. You can see while I'm doing this, I have my airbrush positioned further away from the model, and I have my finger further back on the trigger. For detail work, we want to pull back less and have our brush closer to the figure, and for large sprays like this one, we want to have our brush further away from the model, and pull the trigger almost all the way back on the airbrush to get a nice wide cone of spray. For Xenothal priming larger pieces, we can do the same thing, but we can also go in and do some more detailed highlights if we want to, adding patches of light to areas on the model that we might want to be a little bit lighter. After cleaning out our airbrush using the same method as before, and then putting a bit of thinner in the cup, we can then add a few drops of transparent paint. And in this case, I'm using specifically Citadel Contrast Terradon Turquoise, but any sort of transparent paint will work fine for this task. After doing a Xenothal, one of the most useful tasks we can perform with our airbrush is called color glazing, sometimes called color filters. This is when we use a transparent paint, such as this Citadel Contrast paint that I'm using, or any acrylic ink with a nice transparency to it, to add a thin filter of color on top of our miniature. You can add this on top of an already painted miniature to get all kinds of cool effects, but you can also just apply this filter on top of our already existing Xenothal Prime like we've just done to save a lot of time when painting large models like this piece of terrain. Here you can see I'm starting out with some really broad strokes, spraying the terrain from further back, and then once that's done, we can go in close and add all sorts of shadows and variation to the stonework by using the brush closer up and just barely pulling back the trigger to get these very thin lines. When you first get an airbrush, large terrain pieces are maybe the best way to practice, as they're quite large and quite forgiving to clean up mistakes. In some places on the model here, you can see I'm getting a bit more excess moisture than I'd like. This is sometimes called spider webbing, and we can correct this really quickly by just turning down the PSI on our airbrush. In general, this effect happens when your brush is either too close to the model, your paint is too thin, or your air pressure is too high. So if you are having this problem, just try adjusting any one of these factors, the easiest one typically being the PSI, and you'll be right back on track. You can see here that the opposite can also be true. If your paint is too thick or your pressure is too high, you can get this annoying speckling effect. So here we just would want to do the opposite of the advice I just gave and either make your air pressure higher when using thicker paints, or thin down your paints and keep your air pressure the way it is. Since each paint is a little bit different, I can't give you a specific amount that will fix any situation. And in this case, as with many other things, a lot of practice is just going to be the answer. So from here, my advice would be to go and experiment with these techniques and leave comments down in the description if you have any questions or things I just neglected to cover in this video. And I will make a second video, a response to this one, covering as many of those questions from down in the comments as I can. Thank you so much for watching this video. Thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. And as always, a huge thank you to all of my lovely patrons for supporting the channel. I hope you got something good out of this video, and I will see you in the next video.